There is a particular kind of suffering that comes not from what the world does to you, but from what you become unable to do within the world. It is the suffering of outgrowing the very foundations upon which your life was built, of discovering that the truths you once clung to were merely comfortable illusions, and of realizing that the person you thought you were was only a temporary costume worn by something far more vast and mysterious. This suffering has no name in our contemporary vocabulary, because it belongs to a realm of experience that our culture actively discourages us from exploring. It is the suffering of awakening consciousness, and if you have felt its particular sting, you know exactly what I'm speaking of. You know the peculiar loneliness of seeing through veils that others mistake for reality itself. You know the strange melancholy of losing your ability to participate wholeheartedly in conversations about things that once seemed important, but now appear as elaborate distractions from the only questions that truly matter. You know the disorienting experience of feeling simultaneously more connected to everything and more isolated from everyone around you. This is not the suffering of depression or anxiety, though it may masquerade as such. This is the suffering of a butterfly still partially trapped in its chrysalis, aware of wings it has not yet learned to use, aware of a sky it cannot yet reach. Consider for a moment the caterpillar in its final hours before transformation. Scientists have discovered something remarkable about this process that few of us learn in our elementary understanding of metamorphosis. The caterpillar does not simply grow wings and emerge transformed. Instead, it must first dissolve almost entirely, becoming what biologists call soup within the chrysalis. Nearly every structure that defined its caterpillar existence must be broken down at the cellular level before the butterfly can emerge. But here is the most striking part. Even as the caterpillar's body dissolves, certain clusters of cells called imaginal discs remain intact. These cells carry the blueprint for wings, for antennae, for the entirely different form of life that is about to emerge. They are islands of future possibility floating in an ocean of dissolution. What makes this relevant to our discussion is that these imaginal discs have been present within the caterpillar from the very beginning of its life, dormant, waiting, carrying the secret architecture of transformation that the caterpillar could never have imagined while it was focused on the immediate concerns of leaf eating and survival. Your suffering, the particular kind of existential discomfort you may be experiencing, might be understood as the activity of your own imaginal discs, stirring to life those aspects of your being that have been dormant, waiting for the right conditions to express themselves. But unlike the caterpillar, human transformation does not happen in the privacy of a chrysalis. We must somehow manage to dissolve and reconstitute ourselves while continuing to function in a world that has no patience for such mysterious processes. We must find ways to honor the death of who we were while simultaneously pretending, for the sake of our jobs, our relationships, our social obligations, that nothing fundamental has changed. This creates a peculiar form of exhaustion that goes far deeper than physical tiredness. It is the exhaustion of living simultaneously in multiple dimensions of reality, of speaking languages that increasingly feel foreign to your tongue, of wearing masks that no longer fit the contours of your face. You find yourself going through the motions of your former life, while something within you quietly observes these motions with growing detachment, like watching someone else's home movies of a vacation you never took. The most challenging aspect of this experience is not the confusion or disorientation it brings, though these can be considerable. The most challenging aspect is the isolation it creates between you and the people you care about most. You cannot explain to them why last week's enthusiastic conversation about career advancement now fills you with a kind of existential nausea. You cannot articulate why their well-meaning advice about practical matters sounds like suggestions for rearranging deck chairs on a ship you increasingly suspect is heading toward an iceberg of collective unconsciousness. I want to pause for a moment and ask you directly, when did you first notice that the life you had constructed so carefully was beginning to feel like a beautiful prison? When did you realize that the very achievements you had worked so hard to attain were somehow preventing you from becoming who you are actually meant to be? I know this recognition can be profoundly disorienting because it calls into question not just your choices, but the entire framework within which those choices seemed reasonable. It is like waking up inside a movie and suddenly becoming aware that you are both the actor and the audience, both the character and the one who knows it, is all a performance. The script you have been following so faithfully reveals itself as just one possible interpretation of a much larger story, whose true dimensions you are only beginning to glimpse. I want you to know that this experience of dislocation is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is not evidence that you are losing your grip on reality. On the contrary, it may be the first indication that you are finally beginning to get a grip on reality, that your perception is expanding beyond the narrow bandwidth of consensus consciousness to include frequencies that most people never learn to receive. Your suffering is not pathology, it is emergence. It is the growing pains of a consciousness that is outgrowing the container that once held it so perfectly. And that is why I would like to invite you to share something of your experience in the comments below. You can simply copy this phrase and complete it. I knew I was changing when I could no longer. By sharing your experience, you not only honor your own journey, but also extend a lifeline to someone else who might be struggling with similar feelings of displacement and confusion. Your words might be the confirmation someone needs to trust their own process of transformation, to know they are not alone in this strange territory between who they were and who they are becoming. This community of quietly transforming souls is larger than you might imagine. Scattered though we are across continents and cultures, we recognize each other not by external signs but by a certain quality of attention, a willingness to question assumptions that others take for granted, a capacity to sit comfortably with uncertainty while others rush toward premature closure. We are the ones who have learned to listen to the spaces between words, to pay attention to the subtext beneath surface conversations, to notice the vast emptiness out of which all experiences arise and into which they eventually dissolve. Now let us continue exploring what happens when the familiar structures of identity begin to reveal their provisional nature, when the solid ground of selfhood shows itself to be more like shifting sand than bedrock. The dissolution of a previously stable sense of self is perhaps one of the most disorienting experiences available to human consciousness, precisely because we have been conditioned to believe that having a fixed, coherent identity is not only desirable, but necessary for psychological health. We are taught to fear fragmentation, multiplicity, fluidity of being. We are encouraged to develop what psychologists call a strong ego, as if the ego were a muscle that grows more reliable with exercise. But what happens when your direct experience begins to contradict these fundamental assumptions? What happens when you begin to notice that what you call yourself is actually more like a river than a rock, more like a verb than a noun, more like a temporary arrangement of flowing energies than a fixed entity with clear boundaries? This recognition can be absolutely terrifying, because it threatens everything you thought you knew about how to navigate reality. If you are not the solid, continuous self you believed yourself to be, then who or what is having this experience? If your thoughts are not generated by some central command center called you, then where do they come from? If your emotions are not possessions that belong to your personal identity, then what exactly are they and why do they seem to move through you like weather systems passing through an open sky? These questions, once they begin to arise spontaneously, rather than as mere philosophical curiosities, have a way of restructuring your entire relationship to existence. You can no longer take for granted that your preferences are actually your preferences, rather than cultural programming. You can no longer assume that your beliefs about reality correspond to reality itself, rather than to one particular interpretation of reality among countless others. You can no longer be certain that the voice in your head that claims to be you is actually the most essential aspect of your being, rather than just one function among many within a much larger system of intelligence. This uncertainty is not comfortable, but it is extraordinarily fertile. It creates the kind of open space within which genuine discovery becomes possible. When you are no longer defending a particular version of yourself, you become available to find out what you actually are beneath all the stories, strategies, and self-concepts. When you stop trying to maintain a consistent personality, you discover that consistency was never the point. Authenticity is much more interesting, and authenticity includes the full spectrum of what it means to be human, including the contradictions, the uncertainties, the moments of not knowing who you are or what you want. But here we encounter one of the central paradoxes of consciousness expansion. The very process that liberates you from the prison of a limited identity also separates you from others who remain contentedly identified with their own prisons. Your liberation becomes a form of exile. Your freedom becomes a kind of loneliness. This is not because you become superior to those around you, but because you can no longer participate unconsciously in the collective agreements that make ordinary social reality possible. You can still engage in small talk, but you are increasingly aware that it is small. You can still participate in cultural rituals, but you recognize them as rituals rather than as inevitable expressions of the way things are. You can still maintain your roles as employee, parent, citizen, friend, but these roles no longer define you. They become costumes you wear temporarily for specific purposes rather than identities you inhabit completely. This shift in perspective can be profoundly isolating, because it means you are always, to some degree, pretending when you interact with people who are still fully identified with their roles and stories. You love them, You care about them, but you cannot share with them the territory you are exploring because they do not yet have the maps to make sense of that territory. This loneliness of the awakening consciousness is perhaps the most difficult aspect of the entire process, because it seems to call into question the very possibility of authentic intimacy. How can you be truly close to someone when you cannot share the most significant experiences of your life? How can you maintain genuine connections when your understanding of reality has diverged so dramatically from that of the people you care about? The temptation is either to retreat completely into solitude or to pretend that your transformation is not happening, to try to squeeze yourself back into the container of your former identity for the sake of maintaining your relationships. Both of these responses are understandable, but neither is ultimately satisfying. Retreat leads to a different kind of suffering, the suffering of isolation and disconnection from the human community. Pretense leads to a different kind of death, the death of authenticity and the gradual erosion of your own expanded awareness. What is needed is a third way, a path that honors both your transformation and your connections, that allows you to be who you are becoming without completely abandoning those who love who you were. The secret to navigating this apparent contradiction lies in understanding that your transformation is not ultimately about you as an individual. It is about the evolution of consciousness itself expressing itself through you. You are not becoming something separate from humanity. You are becoming something more human than you knew was possible. Your expanded awareness does not distance you from others. It reveals the deeper connections that were always present, but previously invisible to your more limited perception. Your suffering is not an indication that you are on the wrong path. It is the birth pangs of a more authentic way of being that will ultimately serve not only your own liberation, but the liberation of everyone you encounter. When you understand your transformation in this way, the loneliness becomes more bearable because you recognize it as temporary, as part of the necessary process of breaking out of consensus reality in order to discover what lies beyond it. Your isolation is not permanent exile. It is temporary quarantine while you develop immunity to the collective unconsciousness that keeps most people trapped in cycles of suffering they do not even recognize as suffering. From this perspective, your suffering becomes purposeful rather than meaningless, creative rather than destructive. You begin to see that every moment of discomfort, every experience of not fitting in, every feeling of alienation from your former life is actually evidence that you are growing into something larger than the identity that could no longer contain you. You realize that the person you were was not wrong or bad, but simply too small to accommodate the magnitude of consciousness that is trying to express itself through you. Your former self was like a childhood home that you have outgrown. You have fond memories of it. You appreciate what it provided during the time you needed it, but you cannot continue to live there without damaging both yourself and the structure that once sheltered you. The suffering you experience is not the suffering of loss, but the suffering of birth, the inevitable discomfort that accompanies any transition from a smaller space to a larger one. And like the butterfly emerging from its chrysalis, you cannot force this process or rush it without damaging the very thing you are becoming. So what practical wisdom can we extract from this understanding? How can you navigate the challenges of transformation without losing your sanity or your connections? First, you must learn to trust the process even when you cannot understand it. Your consciousness knows what it is doing, even when your mind does not. The intelligence that is orchestrating your transformation is far more sophisticated than your ability to comprehend or control it. Your job is not to manage this process, but to cooperate with it, to become its ally rather than its opponent. This means learning to say yes to uncertainty, yes to not knowing, yes to the dissolution of everything that once seemed solid and reliable. It means developing what the Zen masters call beginner's mind, the willingness to approach each moment with fresh eyes, free from the burden of knowing what everything means or how everything should unfold. Second, you must learn to find your community among others who are undergoing similar transformations. This does not necessarily mean joining formal spiritual communities or adopting particular belief systems. It means developing the sensitivity to recognize kindred spirits wherever they may appear. Sometimes they are hidden in plain sight, wearing the costumes of ordinary life while quietly navigating their own processes of awakening. Sometimes they appear in unexpected places, in chance conversations with strangers, in books that find their way into your hands at exactly the right moment, in dreams that feel more real than waking life. Your task is to remain open to these connections while releasing attachment to how they should look or where they should come from. The universe is far more creative than your expectations. Third, you must learn to translate your expanding awareness into forms that can be useful in ordinary reality, without compromising the essential nature of what you have discovered. This is perhaps the greatest challenge of all: how to bring the insights of expanded consciousness into a world that is still organized around much more limited ways of perceiving and being. You must become bilingual, fluent, both in the language of transformation and in the language of everyday life. You must learn to speak truth in ways that can be heard by people who are not yet ready to question their basic assumptions about reality. This requires tremendous compassion and patience, both with others and with yourself. It requires the wisdom to know when to speak and when to remain silent, when to push boundaries and when to respect them, when to challenge existing structures and when to work within them. Finally, you must remember that your transformation is not an end in itself, but a means to something far greater. You are not expanding your consciousness for your own benefit alone, though you will certainly benefit. You are not awakening for your own liberation alone, though you will certainly be liberated. You are part of a much larger movement of consciousness that is occurring across the planet, a collective awakening that includes every person who has ever felt the stirrings of questions that cannot be answered within conventional frameworks. Your individual transformation contributes to this collective transformation in ways you may never fully understand, just as the awakening of others has contributed to your own journey in ways you may never fully recognize. You are part of an invisible network of expanding awareness that spans cultures, continents, and centuries. Your suffering is not isolated. It is connected to the suffering of every other consciousness that has ever outgrown the limitations of its previous understanding. When you understand your experience from this broader perspective, something remarkable happens. The suffering that once seemed meaningless reveals itself as profoundly meaningful. The loneliness that once seemed like evidence of your alienation from life reveals itself as evidence of your deeper connection to life. The confusion that once seemed like a sign of your inadequacy reveals itself as a sign of your readiness to embrace a larger order of understanding. You discover that what you had interpreted as your weakness was actually your strength, that what you had experienced as your limitation was actually your liberation. The very sensitivity that made you unable to continue participating unconsciously in collective illusions becomes the sensitivity that allows you to perceive realities that are invisible to others. The very openness that made you vulnerable to existential questioning becomes the openness through which deeper truths can enter your awareness. Your silent suffering, the suffering that has no name in our vocabulary because it belongs to territories our culture has not yet learned to map, becomes a doorway into a more authentic way of being human. It reveals dimensions of yourself that you never suspected existed. It connects you to sources of wisdom and strength that you never knew were available. It initiates you into mysteries that cannot be taught, but only lived. Secrets that cannot be spoken, but only embodied. You discover that you are much larger than you ever imagined, much more resilient than you ever believed, much more connected to the source of all things than you ever dared to hope. The identity you thought was so solid and important was just the surface of an ocean whose depths you are only beginning to explore. Trust the process. Trust your growth and trust that life, in its infinite intelligence, is guiding you exactly where you need to go. What emerges is much more beautiful, much more free, much more alive than what was lost. And when you finally transcend the limitations that once seemed insurmountable, you realize that you have always been free. If these reflections on the transformative nature of silent suffering touched something within you, know that you are not alone on this journey. This path of consciousness expansion can seem isolating when those around you don't understand the transformations you're experiencing. It's precisely for this reason that we've created this safe space, this refuge for seekers like you. By subscribing to the channel, you become part of a silent community of people who, like you, are navigating between two worlds, the conventional and the expansive. Each new video we share is like a beacon in the fog, illuminating a bit more of the path ahead, offering new perspectives on how to integrate your mystical experiences into everyday life without losing your authenticity. We're not here to offer easy answers or empty promises of instant enlightenment. We're here to walk together, to explore the mysteries of consciousness with honesty and depth, to validate your experience when the world around you cannot understand it. If you feel you're growing in ways that others around you are not, if you perceive realities that go unnoticed by most, this channel is your sanctuary. Subscribe and allow yourself to be nourished by reflections that recognize both the beauty and the challenge of your awakening. Together, we form an invisible web of expanding consciousnesses, each at our own pace, but connected by authentic seeking. A simple click on the subscription button is a silent whisper that says, "I too am on this path. I too am awakening. And that, in a world that often makes us feel alienated in our own expanded perception, is an invaluable treasure.